Plotinus begins his philosophy with a radical idea that stands at the heart of everything he teaches. Reality is not merely the collection of physical objects that surround us, nor is it limited to what the senses can perceive. Beneath the changing world of appearances lies a deeper and more fundamental source from which all existence flows. Human beings spend much of their lives focused on particular things. Individual people, possessions, achievements, desires, and fears. Yet these are only fragments of a much larger reality. To understand existence fully, one must move beyond the surface of things and seek the ultimate principle from which everything originates. At the center of his philosophy stands what he calls the One. The One is not a god in the ordinary sense, not a powerful being among other beings, and not a person sitting somewhere within the universe. The One is beyond all categories, beyond all descriptions, beyond even existence as it is normally understood. Every attempt to define it falls short because definitions create limits, and the One has no limits. It is absolute unity, absolute simplicity, and absolute perfection. This idea may initially appear strange because human beings naturally think in terms of objects, qualities, and distinctions. Everything encountered in ordinary life has characteristics that separate it from something else. A tree is not a river. A person is not a mountain. Every object has boundaries. The One, however, exists beyond all division. It cannot be compared to anything because comparison requires difference, and difference belongs only to the world that emerges after unity has already been broken into multiplicity. Plotinus argues that all reality flows outward from the One in a process he describes as emanation. He uses metaphors such as sunlight radiating from the sun or water overflowing from a spring. The source does not diminish itself by giving rise to what comes after it. The sun does not lose its light by shining. Likewise, the One remains complete while all levels of reality emerge from its abundance. The first reality to emerge from the One is the realm of intellect. Here exists perfect understanding, perfect order, and the eternal forms of all things. Plotinus inherits much from Plato, especially the belief that behind the imperfect objects of the physical world stand perfect realities that never change. Yet he develops this idea further. Intellect is not merely a collection of abstract forms. It is a living realm of pure thought where truth exists in complete unity and harmony. Within intellect, there is no confusion, no ignorance, and no contradiction. Everything is known directly and completely. Human beings experience knowledge gradually, learning one thing after another through effort and uncertainty. Intellect possesses total understanding simultaneously. It sees all reality in a single vision. This realm is closer to the One than anything within the material world because it retains a greater degree of unity and perfection. From intellect emerges soul. Soul occupies an intermediate position between eternal realities and the changing world of matter. It serves as a bridge connecting higher and lower levels of existence. Through soul, the order and beauty of the higher realms become reflected within the physical universe. Nature itself, with its patterns, structures, and living forms, expresses the activity of soul. Human beings possess souls because they participate in this larger reality. According to Plotinus, the soul is not merely a byproduct of the body. It does not originate from material processes alone. Rather, the soul belongs fundamentally to a higher order of existence. Although embodied individuals often identify completely with physical life, a deeper part of them remains connected to realities beyond the material world. This connection becomes one of the central themes of his philosophy. Human suffering frequently arises because people forget their true nature. They become absorbed in temporary concerns, attaching themselves entirely to wealth, status, pleasure, fear, ambition, and external circumstances. These things are not necessarily evil in themselves, but they distract attention from what is most essential. The soul gradually becomes entangled in lower realities and loses awareness of its origin. For Plotinus, philosophy is therefore not simply an intellectual exercise. It is a spiritual journey of remembrance. The goal is not merely to acquire information, but to awaken to a deeper understanding of oneself and reality. Human beings must learn to turn inward, not in a selfish sense, but in order to discover the higher dimensions of their own nature. He believes that many people spend their lives looking outward for fulfillment. They seek happiness through possessions, recognition, power, or sensory pleasures. Yet these pursuits never provide lasting satisfaction because everything within the physical world remains subject to change. What is gained today can be lost tomorrow. What brings pleasure now may eventually bring disappointment. Permanent fulfillment cannot be found within impermanent things. This insight leads him toward a profound form of inwardness. The soul must gradually detach itself from excessive dependence upon external circumstances and cultivate awareness of higher realities. Such detachment does not mean rejecting life entirely. Rather, it means recognizing that material existence is not the ultimate source of value or identity. Beauty plays an important role in this process because beauty serves as a reminder of higher realities. When people encounter genuine beauty, whether in nature, art, music, or character, they experience something that points beyond the immediate object itself. Beauty awakens longing. It stirs a sense that there is something greater than what appears on the surface. For Plotinus, this experience is not accidental. Beauty reflects the presence of order, unity, and form descending from higher levels of reality. The attraction people feel toward beauty therefore reveals something important about the soul. It demonstrates that human beings naturally seek transcendence. They desire not merely individual objects, but the deeper perfection those objects imperfectly reflect. Every longing for beauty ultimately points toward the source of all beauty, just as every search for truth points toward the source of all truth. As his philosophy develops, a remarkable vision begins to emerge. Human life is not simply a temporary biological event occurring within an indifferent universe. It is part of a vast spiritual movement. The soul originates from higher realities, descends into the world of change, and possesses the capacity to return toward its source through contemplation, self-knowledge, and inner transformation. Yet this return is neither automatic nor easy. The distractions of ordinary life constantly pull attention outward. Desire fragments consciousness. Fear narrows perception. Pride inflates the ego. The soul becomes scattered among countless concerns and forgets the unity from which it came. The task of philosophy is therefore one of recollection, gathering the scattered self and directing it once again toward what is highest. For Plotinus, every human being carries within themselves the possibility of this ascent. No matter how deeply immersed one becomes in material concerns, the connection to higher reality is never completely severed. The soul retains an inner orientation toward the good, the true, and the beautiful. The challenge is learning to recognize and cultivate that orientation rather than allowing it to remain buried beneath the noise of ordinary existence. The deeper Plotinus explores the nature of the soul, the more he becomes convinced that human beings live in a state of partial forgetfulness. Most people identify themselves almost entirely with their bodies, emotions, possessions, social roles, and personal histories. They believe these changing aspects of life constitute their complete identity. Yet for him, this is only the outer layer of existence. Beneath the shifting surface remains something far more enduring, a spiritual reality that participates in a higher order beyond the material world. This forgetfulness explains why so many people experience restlessness even when outwardly successful. Wealth, status, pleasure, and achievement may satisfy certain desires temporarily, yet they rarely produce lasting peace. Human beings often reach goals they once believed would complete them only to discover that the feeling of fulfillment fades quickly. new desires emerge, new ambitions take shape, and the cycle begins again. Plotinus sees this as evidence that the soul seeks something deeper than any finite object can provide. The reason for this dissatisfaction lies in the nature of desire itself. Every particular object can satisfy only a limited need, yet the soul longs for something unlimited, something complete and permanent. People may mistakenly direct this longing toward material things, relationships, or accomplishments, but beneath these pursuits exists a deeper yearning for unity, truth, beauty, and goodness themselves. The soul seeks the source behind all temporary reflections. Because of this, he views the philosophical life as a gradual purification of attention. Purification does not mean rejecting the world with hatred or treating the body as evil. Rather, it involves learning to distinguish between what is temporary and what is lasting, between appearances and deeper realities. The individual begins to free themselves from excessive attachment to external circumstances and becomes increasingly oriented toward what transcends change. Virtue plays an essential role in this transformation. Plotinus does not see morality merely as a social necessity or a set of rules imposed from outside. Virtue reflects the natural order of the soul when it is properly aligned with higher realities. Justice, wisdom, courage, and moderation are not arbitrary standards. They are expressions of inner harmony. A virtuous person is not simply obeying moral commands. They are bringing their soul into closer conformity with truth itself. When individuals are dominated by uncontrolled desires, anger, greed, envy, or vanity, their consciousness becomes fragmented. Different impulses pull them in conflicting directions, creating inner disorder. The soul loses its unity and becomes absorbed in lower concerns. Virtue restores order by integrating the person around higher values. It gathers the scattered elements of the self and directs them toward what is genuinely good. This idea of inner harmony reflects a broader principle running throughout his philosophy. Reality itself is structured according to degrees of unity. The closer something is to the one, the greater its coherence, beauty, and perfection. The further it moves from the one, the more fragmented and unstable it becomes. Human flourishing, therefore, depends upon participating as fully as possible in this movement toward unity. He often describes the spiritual journey as an ascent. This ascent is not a physical movement from one place to another. It is a transformation of consciousness. The soul rises by turning away from distractions and becoming increasingly aware of higher dimensions of reality. Each stage of understanding reveals a deeper level of truth, leading ultimately toward direct awareness of the source from which all things emerge. Contemplation becomes one of the primary means through which this ascent occurs. Plotinus believes that the highest activities of the soul are not centered upon action alone, but upon vision and understanding. Human beings spend much of their lives reacting to external events, pursuing goals, solving problems, and navigating practical concerns. While these activities have their place, they often keep attention fixed on the surface of existence. Contemplation allows consciousness to move inward and upward toward realities that cannot be grasped through ordinary sensory experience. For him, true contemplation is not passive daydreaming. It is an intense form of awareness in which the mind gradually transcends its usual limitations. The individual begins by reflecting upon beauty, order, and truth as they appear in the world. Over time, attention moves beyond particular examples toward the universal principles they reflect. Eventually, consciousness approaches the realm of intellect itself, where truth exists in its purest form. Yet even intellect is not the final destination. Beyond thought lies the one. This presents a profound challenge because thought always involves distinctions. To think is to separate subject from object, knower from known. The one transcends all such divisions. It cannot be fully understood through concepts because concepts themselves belong to a lower level of reality. This is why Plotinus frequently speaks of a kind of mystical union. The highest experience available to the soul is not intellectual understanding alone, but direct participation in unity itself. In rare moments, the barriers separating self and source fall away. The soul becomes absorbed in a reality beyond language, beyond images, beyond ordinary consciousness. Such experiences cannot be adequately described because description depends upon distinctions that no longer apply. He treats these moments as the culmination of the philosophical life. They reveal that the deepest truth of existence is not fragmentation, but unity. Beneath the countless divisions that characterize ordinary experience lies an underlying source from which all things emerge and toward which all things ultimately tend. Yet he does not suggest that such experiences remove individuals permanently from everyday life. Human beings continue living within the world of change, carrying out responsibilities, forming relationships, and facing practical challenges. The difference is that they do so with a transformed perspective. Having glimpsed a higher reality, they become less enslaved by temporary concerns and less vulnerable to the fluctuations of fortune. Fear begins to lose some of its power because external losses no longer appear absolute. Desire becomes more balanced because the soul is no longer seeking ultimate fulfillment in temporary things. Even suffering acquires a different significance because it is understood within the context of a larger spiritual reality rather than viewed as the entirety of existence. As these reflections deepen, Plotinus presents a vision of life that is both demanding and hopeful. Human beings are called to rise above mere appearances, to cultivate virtue, to seek wisdom, and to remember their deepest nature. The path requires discipline, self-examination, and patience, yet it remains open to anyone willing to undertake the journey. For within every soul exists a hidden connection to the highest reality, waiting to be rediscovered through the long and gradual ascent toward unity. As Plotinus continues his exploration of reality, he becomes increasingly concerned with a question that has troubled many philosophers before him. If the source of all existence is perfect, how can imperfection, suffering, ignorance, and evil exist within the world? At first glance, this appears to be a serious challenge. If all things ultimately originate from the highest and most perfect reality, why does the world contain so much disorder and limitation? His answer is unusual because he does not treat evil as an independent force opposing the good. Evil is not a rival power standing against the one. Rather, it is a lack, a deficiency, a weakening of participation in the fullness of reality. Just as darkness is not a substance in itself, but the absence of light, evil represents a diminishing of goodness, unity, and order. The further existence moves away from its source, the more fragmentation and imperfection appear. This understanding shapes his view of the material world. Plotinus is often misunderstood as simply rejecting matter, yet his position is more subtle. He does not deny the beauty of nature or the value of embodied life. The physical world remains an expression of higher realities. It contains beauty, harmony, and order precisely because it reflects the influence of soul and intellect. Yet matter occupies the lowest level within the hierarchy of existence because it possesses the least unity and the greatest degree of change. Everything in the material world is unstable. Bodies age, buildings decay, empires rise and fall. Relationships begin and end. Every physical thing exists within time and therefore remains vulnerable to transformation and loss. For Plotinus, this instability explains why human beings experience so much anxiety when they place their ultimate hopes in worldly things. What changes cannot provide permanent security? This realization does not require abandoning life. Instead, it calls for a change in perspective. The wise person appreciates temporary goods without mistaking them for ultimate realities. Beauty can be enjoyed. Relationships can be cherished. Success can be valued. Yet none of these should become the foundation of one's identity, because they belong to a realm defined by impermanence. His philosophy, therefore, becomes a training in detachment, though not in the sense of emotional coldness. True detachment means freedom from slavery to circumstances. A person who bases their happiness entirely upon external conditions becomes vulnerable to constant instability because external conditions inevitably change. By rooting the soul in higher realities, individuals develop a kind of inner independence that remains intact even amid life's uncertainties. This inward freedom becomes one of the most remarkable features of his thought. Plotinus believes that every person possesses an inner sanctuary untouched by the chaos of the external world. While bodies may suffer, fortunes may change, and societies may collapse, the deepest part of the soul remains connected to a reality beyond these fluctuations. Philosophy helps individuals rediscover this hidden center. The journey inward, however, is not merely psychological. It is also metaphysical. To know one's self properly is to discover that one's true identity extends beyond ordinary individuality. Human beings often define themselves through personal characteristics, memories, occupations, desires, and social roles. Yet these are temporary expressions rather than the deepest truth of who they are. Beneath these layers lies a soul participating in a universal order that transcends the individual self. Because of this, self-knowledge and knowledge of reality ultimately become inseparable. The more deeply one understands a soul, the more one understands the structure of existence itself. The inward path gradually reveals dimensions of reality inaccessible through the senses alone. What appears at first to be self-exploration becomes a journey toward the source of all things. Beauty continues to serve as a guide throughout this ascent. Plotinus believes people are often transformed by beauty because beauty awakens recognition. When someone encounters a beautiful landscape, a work of art, a piece of music, or an act of extraordinary virtue, something within them responds immediately. They feel drawn beyond the object itself toward a deeper perfection that the object reflects. This attraction reveals the soul's hidden memory of higher realities. The highest forms of beauty, therefore, are not merely physical. Moral beauty, intellectual beauty, and spiritual beauty stand closer to the source because they express greater degrees of unity and order. A wise and virtuous soul possesses a beauty more profound than any external appearance because it reflects the structure of reality more faithfully. This emphasis upon inner transformation distinguishes his philosophy from purely theoretical systems. Knowledge alone is not enough. A person may understand philosophical ideas intellectually while remaining spiritually unchanged. Genuine philosophy requires becoming different. The soul must be shaped by what it knows. Wisdom is measured not only by understanding, but by the degree to which one's life reflects higher truths. As the ascent continues, the distinction between knowing and being gradually begins to dissolve. The soul does not merely learn about unity. It becomes more unified. It does not merely think about goodness. It becomes more good. Philosophy ceases to be the accumulation of concepts and becomes a process of participation in reality itself. This transformation requires patience because the habits of ordinary life continually pull attention downward. Desire seeks immediate satisfaction. Fear clings to temporary securities. Pride strengthens attachment to the ego. The soul must repeatedly turn away from these distractions and redirect itself toward what is lasting. This work is not completed in a single moment, but unfolds gradually through discipline and contemplation. For Plotinus, however, the effort is worthwhile because it aligns human existence with its deepest purpose. The soul was never meant to remain trapped within the surface level of reality. It possesses an innate orientation toward transcendence, a longing for the source from which it came. Every search for truth, every attraction to beauty, every desire for goodness ultimately expresses this deeper movement. And so the philosophical life becomes a return, not to a physical location, but to a forgotten origin. The soul rises step by step from fragmentation toward unity, from distraction toward contemplation, from appearance toward reality, discovering along the way that what it seeks has always been present at the deepest level of its own being, quietly calling it home toward the source beyond all things. As Plotinus brings his philosophy to its highest point, everything returns to the One, the ultimate source from which all reality flows and toward which all reality ultimately tends. The journey of the soul is not simply a search for knowledge, happiness, or moral improvement. It is a movement toward reunion with the deepest foundation of existence itself. Every human longing, whether for truth, beauty, goodness, love, or meaning, is ultimately an expression of this desire to return to the source. For him, the greatest mistake people make is identifying themselves entirely with the changing world. They become absorbed in possessions, achievements, pleasures, fears, and social identities, forgetting that these things are temporary reflections rather than ultimate realities. Because everything in the material world changes, those who depend upon it completely are destined to experience anxiety and disappointment. Lasting peace can never come from what is constantly passing away. The wise person, therefore, learns to live within the world without becoming enslaved by it. They appreciate beauty without clinging to it. They engage in relationships without losing themselves in them. They fulfill responsibilities without believing that external success defines their worth. Their center of gravity gradually shifts from the outer world to the inner life of the soul. This inward turn is not an escape from reality, but a movement toward a deeper reality. The soul discovers that beneath all change lies an enduring order, and beneath all multiplicity lies unity. What appears fragmented from the perspective of ordinary experience is ultimately connected through its common origin in the One. Contemplation becomes the highest expression of this realization. In contemplation, the soul rises above the noise of everyday concerns and directs itself toward what is eternal. The individual begins to perceive reality not as a collection of isolated objects, but as a living expression of a deeper unity. This vision brings a kind of peace unavailable through external achievements because it is rooted in what does not change. At the summit of the philosophical life stands the possibility of mystical union. Plotinus describes rare moments when the soul transcends ordinary consciousness and experiences direct participation in the One. In such moments, distinctions between self and source disappear. There is no longer a separate observer looking at reality. There is only unity itself. These experiences cannot be fully explained because language belongs to the world of distinctions, while the One lies beyond all distinctions. Yet, even if such moments are rare, they reveal the true direction of human existence. The purpose of life is not merely survival or pleasure. It is spiritual ascent. Human beings are called to become more unified, more virtuous, more contemplative, and more aware of the higher realities reflected within themselves and the world around them. In the end, Plotinus offers a vision of existence that is both deeply philosophical and profoundly spiritual. Reality is not a meaningless collection of accidents, but a vast order flowing from a perfect source. The soul is not trapped permanently in the world of change, but carries within itself a connection to eternity. Through virtue, contemplation, self-knowledge, and inner transformation, human beings can gradually awaken to this truth. And so his final message remains one of return. Beneath all distractions, beneath all desires, beneath all fears and ambitions, the soul carries a quiet memory of its origin. The task of philosophy is to awaken that memory, to turn inward, and to follow it upward until the restless search for fulfillment finally finds its completion in the unity from which all things came and toward which all things forever move. Imagine living in a world where empires ruled millions of people, where merchants crossed deserts carrying silk and spices between continents, where philosophers debated beneath marble columns, and where ancient religions, myths, and scientific ideas collided in the crowded cities of the Mediterranean. It was a world of enormous wealth and immense uncertainty. The Roman Empire still appeared powerful from the outside, yet beneath its strength many people felt something difficult to name. Traditional beliefs no longer satisfied everyone. New religions were spreading. Old gods seemed less convincing than they once had. Educated people increasingly found themselves trapped between reason and faith, between material success and a strange longing for something deeper. In this atmosphere, during the early 3rd century, a man named Plotinus was born. Few people at the time could have imagined that he would eventually become one of the most influential philosophers in Western history, shaping Christian thinkers, Islamic scholars, Renaissance intellectuals, and countless seekers for nearly 2,000 years. The strange thing about Plotinus is that he seemed almost uninterested in his own fame. Unlike many philosophers who carefully documented their lives, he left surprisingly little personal information behind. Even his students knew relatively little about his childhood. Historians believe he was born around the year 204 or 205 in Roman Egypt, a land that had already been a crossroads of civilizations for thousands of years. Egypt was not merely a province of the Roman Empire. It was a place where Greek philosophy, Egyptian spirituality, Roman politics, and ancient traditions existed side by side. Temples stood near libraries. Merchants from distant lands shared streets with scholars and priests. The very atmosphere encouraged questions about the nature of reality, the soul, and humanity's place in the universe. As a young man, Plotinus became consumed by those questions. While many people focused on practical concerns such as wealth, status, family, or political advancement, he seemed drawn towards something far more elusive. He wanted to understand what was ultimately real, not merely what appeared real, but what existed beneath appearances themselves. This distinction would later become the foundation of his entire philosophy. Most people move through life accepting the world exactly as it presents itself. They see objects, people, events, successes, failures, pleasures, and pains, and assume these things represent reality in its deepest form. Plotinus suspected otherwise. He sensed that behind the visible world existed something more fundamental, something from which everything else emerged. This search eventually led him to Alexandria, one of the greatest intellectual centers of the ancient world. To understand the significance of this journey, it helps to imagine what Alexandria represented during that period. It was not simply a city. It was one of humanity's great meeting places for ideas. Scholars discussed mathematics, astronomy, medicine, religion, literature, and philosophy. Different cultures met there daily. New theories were constantly emerging. For someone obsessed with understanding existence itself, there were few places more exciting. Yet despite the city's reputation, Plotinus found himself disappointed. He listened to many teachers and studied many systems of thought, but none seemed capable of answering the questions that haunted him. He was not looking for clever arguments alone. He was searching for wisdom that could transform a human life completely. Everything changed when he encountered a teacher named Ammonius Saccas. Very little is known about Ammonius today because he left no writings of his own. Yet his influence on Plotinus was profound. According to later accounts, Plotinus immediately recognized that he had found the guide he had been seeking. For more than a decade, he studied under him. These years would become the hidden foundation beneath everything he later taught. While history cannot tell us every detail of their discussions, we know that Plotinus emerged from this period with a vision of reality radically different from the one held by most people around him. At the heart of this vision was a simple but astonishing idea. Reality, he believed, is not a collection of separate things accidentally existing alongside one another. Instead, everything originates from a single source. Every beautiful object, every living creature, every thought, every act of love, every truth, every moment of consciousness ultimately flows from a deeper unity hidden beneath the surface of existence. Plotinus would eventually call this source the One. The name itself can be misleading because modern listeners often imagine a powerful being somewhere in the universe. That was not what Plotinus meant. The One was not a god sitting above creation. It was not even a being among other beings. In his view, it was beyond all categories, beyond language, beyond description, beyond anything the human mind could fully grasp. It was the ultimate source from which everything else emerged, much as countless rays of sunlight emerge from a single sun. What made this idea so powerful was the way it transformed everyday life. For Plotinus, philosophy was never merely an intellectual exercise. It was a guide for living. He observed that most people spend their lives chasing temporary things. Wealth arrives and then loses its excitement. Success brings satisfaction for a moment before new desires appear. Recognition fades. Pleasures pass quickly. Even achievements that once seemed enormously important eventually feel strangely incomplete. Human beings keep searching because something inside them remains unsatisfied. Long before modern psychology explored similar questions, Plotinus noticed this restless quality of human desire. He saw people moving from one ambition to another, convinced that fulfillment was always waiting just beyond the next accomplishment. Yet the feeling rarely lasted. This observation led him to a remarkable conclusion. Perhaps the soul is not truly searching for money, power, pleasure, or status at all. Perhaps it is searching for something deeper without realizing it. Perhaps every desire is ultimately a distorted attempt to return to the source from which it came. This idea gave his philosophy a deeply personal dimension. The journey toward truth was not about learning more information. It was about remembering something forgotten. Human beings, he believed, are not merely physical creatures wandering through a meaningless universe. There is a spiritual dimension within them connected to a reality greater than anything they encounter through their senses. The tragedy of ordinary life is that people become so distracted by external pursuits that they forget this connection entirely. As these ideas matured, Plotinus began developing a vision of existence unlike anything most of his contemporaries had encountered. The visible world was real, but it was not the highest reality. Beneath changing events, beneath material objects, beneath individual identities, there existed a deeper order. To understand that order would become the great mission of his life. Yet what made him extraordinary was not simply the ideas he developed. It was the intensity with which he pursued them. He was not content to describe higher reality intellectually. He wanted to experience it directly. The philosopher was becoming something more than a thinker. He was becoming a seeker attempting to climb beyond the ordinary limits of human perception itself, and that journey would eventually lead him towards some of the most profound and influential insights in the entire history of philosophy. As Plotinus grew older, the search that had begun in Alexandria gradually became something far more ambitious. He was no longer simply trying to understand reality. He was trying to map the entire structure of existence itself. Most philosophers before him had focused on ethics, politics, logic, or the natural world. Plotinus asked a question that was both simpler and more difficult. If everything comes from a single source, how exactly does the universe emerge from that source without losing its unity? The answer he developed would become one of the most influential visions in the history of philosophy. To understand it, imagine standing on a mountain at sunrise. The sun rises above the horizon and light spreads across the landscape. The sunlight reaches forests, rivers, villages, and distant hills, yet the sun loses nothing by giving its light away. The source remains full even while countless things receive its radiance. Plotinus believed reality unfolds in a similar way. The one, the ultimate source of existence, overflows with perfection. Existence itself pours outward from it naturally, not because the one chooses to create in the human sense, but because absolute fullness naturally gives rise to everything below it. This idea fascinated later generations because it solved a problem that had troubled philosophers for centuries. How can a perfect source produce an imperfect world? Plotinus argued that the world is not imperfect because the source is flawed. Rather, imperfection appears gradually as reality moves farther from its origin, just as light becomes dimmer the farther it travels from its source. From the one emerges what Plotinus called intellect, the realm of perfect forms. This was heavily inspired by Plato, who believed that behind every imperfect object in the physical world exists an ideal version. Every beautiful thing participates in beauty itself. Every act of justice participates in justice itself. Plotinus expanded this idea into an entire cosmic structure. Intellect contains the eternal patterns from which all reality takes shape. It is a realm not of physical objects but of pure understanding, where truth exists without distortion. Yet even this was not the final stage. From intellect emerges soul, the living principle connecting the eternal world to the changing world of matter. Through soul, life spreads throughout the cosmos. Through soul, the universe becomes animated and alive rather than a collection of dead objects. Human beings themselves participate in this cosmic process because each person possesses a soul that originates from a higher reality. To modern listeners, this may sound abstract, but for Plotinus it was intensely practical. The entire structure of reality explains something he observed about human life. People often feel divided against themselves. Part of them seeks wisdom, beauty, and truth, while another part becomes trapped in appetite, distraction, and endless desire. They sense that they are capable of something greater, yet continually find themselves pulled downward by ordinary concerns. Plotinus believed this tension exists because the soul lives between two worlds. One part of it remains connected to its higher origin, while another part becomes absorbed in material existence. Human life is therefore not simply about surviving, accumulating possessions, or gaining status. It is a journey of remembrance, a journey of returning inward toward the source from which the soul came. This conviction shaped the way he lived. Unlike many intellectuals who enjoyed public recognition, Plotinus cared little for fame. Accounts from his students describe a man who seemed almost detached from worldly ambitions. He was respected by powerful people, admired by fellow philosophers, and eventually became one of the most sought-after teachers in Rome. Yet he treated these things as secondary. What mattered was the inner life. Around the age of 40, Plotinus moved to Rome, the center of the empire. At first glance, this might seem like an unusual place for a philosopher obsessed with spiritual reality. Rome was a city of wealth, politics, military power, and social competition. Yet it was also a place where ambitious minds gathered. Over time, his lectures attracted senators, intellectuals, physicians, and influential citizens. They came not because he promised success or political advantage, but because he offered something increasingly rare, a vision of existence that gave meaning to the human search for truth. His teaching style was unusual. He was not known for theatrical speeches or rhetorical brilliance. In fact, some accounts suggest he spoke in a way that could seem awkward or unpolished. What captivated people was not his performance but the depth of his thought. Students often felt they were listening to someone who genuinely believed the realities he described. He did not present philosophy as speculation. He spoke as though he were describing a landscape he had personally explored. Among those students was a man named Porphyry, who would later become one of the most important figures in preserving Plotinus's legacy. When Porphyry first encountered him, he found not a distant academic, but someone whose entire life revolved around a profound inner quest. Their relationship would eventually become crucial because Plotinus himself wrote reluctantly. He preferred teaching and contemplation. Without Porphyry, much of his philosophy might have disappeared entirely. Yet during these years, something even more remarkable was happening beneath the surface of his intellectual work. Plotinus was becoming increasingly convinced that philosophy alone was not enough. Understanding reality intellectually was valuable, but true fulfillment required direct experience. Reading about beauty is not the same as encountering beauty. Studying love is not the same as loving. Likewise, thinking about ultimate reality is not the same as experiencing it. This conviction led him toward one of the most extraordinary aspects of his philosophy. He believed that human beings could, under rare circumstances, experience a direct union with the One itself. Not through ritual, not through magical practices, not through blind faith, through inner transformation. According to accounts recorded by Porphyry, Plotinus himself experienced such states several times during his life. These moments were difficult to describe because ordinary language depends upon distinctions between subject and object, self and world, observer and observed. In these experiences, those distinctions seemed to dissipate. There was only unity. Whether one interprets these accounts philosophically, psychologically, or spiritually, they reveal something essential about Plotinus. He was never content with theory alone. He wanted reality itself. He wanted to know whether the deepest truths human beings talk about could actually be encountered directly. This desire gave his philosophy an emotional power that pure intellectual systems often lack. At its heart was a profoundly hopeful message. Human beings are not trapped forever in confusion, distraction, and desire. Beneath the noise of ordinary life exists a deeper dimension waiting to be discovered. The soul's longing for truth, beauty, and goodness is not an accident. It is a sign pointing back toward its origin. As the years passed and his reputation spread throughout Rome, more students gathered around him. Some came seeking answers. Others came seeking wisdom. Many left feeling they had encountered a thinker unlike any other. Yet the most important chapters of his story were still ahead, because the ideas developing in his school would soon face challenges, criticism, and the ultimate test that every philosophy must eventually confront: the reality of human suffering, aging, and death. As the decades passed, Plotinus became one of the most respected philosophers in Rome. But what made him remarkable was not merely the complexity of his ideas. It was the way those ideas shaped his understanding of everyday human life. Unlike many philosophical systems that remain trapped in abstract discussions, Plotinus constantly returned to a practical question. If the soul truly comes from a higher reality, why do human beings spend so much of their lives feeling lost, dissatisfied, and divided against themselves? The answer, he believed, could be seen everywhere. People chase things that promise fulfillment, but rarely deliver it for long. A young person dreams of wealth, convinced that financial success will finally bring peace. Years are spent pursuing it. Then, after achieving what once seemed so important, a strange emptiness remains. Another goal appears. Another ambition emerges. The cycle begins again. The same pattern repeats with fame, status, beauty, power, and even knowledge itself. Human beings are constantly reaching outward, yet something inside them remains restless. Plotinus did not view this restlessness as a flaw. In fact, he thought it revealed something profound about human nature. The soul is restless because it is searching for something infinite while living among finite things. Every temporary object eventually disappoints because it cannot satisfy a longing that points beyond the material world. This does not mean wealth, friendship, achievement, or beauty are worthless. Plotinus appreciated beauty deeply. He admired intelligence. He valued virtue and friendship. The problem arose when people mistook these things for the ultimate destination rather than signs pointing towards something greater. One of the most fascinating aspects of his philosophy was the way he understood beauty. Most people assume beauty is simply a matter of personal preference. One person likes a painting, another does not. One person finds a landscape beautiful, another remains indifferent. Plotinus approached beauty differently. He believed beauty affects us so deeply because it reminds the soul of its origin. When we encounter extraordinary beauty in art, music, nature, or even another human being, we experience a brief awakening. Something inside us recognizes a deeper harmony hidden beneath ordinary existence. This explains why beautiful experiences can feel strangely emotional even when they have no practical value. A sunset does not solve our problems. A piece of music does not feed us. Yet both can move us profoundly. Plotinus believed these moments matter because they pull the soul upward. They remind us that reality contains dimensions beyond immediate survival and material concerns. This upward movement became the central goal of his philosophy. He often described spiritual growth as a process of purification. Modern listeners sometimes misunderstand this word. imagining harsh self-denial or rejection of the physical world. That was not his intention. Purification meant freeing the soul from unnecessary attachments that cloud its perception. Just as muddy water cannot reflect sunlight clearly, a mind consumed by greed, vanity, resentment, or endless distraction struggles to perceive higher truths. What is striking is how relevant this observation still feels today. Plotinus lived nearly 18 centuries before smartphones, social media, and 24-hour entertainment. Yet he understood something fundamental about human attention. The more people become absorbed in superficial pursuits, the harder it becomes for them to notice deeper realities. They become trapped in a cycle of reaction and desire, moving from one distraction to another without ever asking where their lives are actually heading. His students were often amazed by the consistency between his teachings and his personal conduct. Ancient sources describe a man who genuinely seemed less interested in material rewards than most people around him. He cared little for luxury. He avoided unnecessary displays of status. He maintained close friendships and treated students with unusual kindness. Several accounts suggest that he quietly helped orphans and supported people facing difficulties, not because he wanted recognition, but because compassion naturally followed from his understanding of human unity. This aspect of Plotinus is sometimes overlooked. It is easy to imagine him as a detached mystic lost in abstract contemplation, but the historical record paints a more human picture. He was deeply engaged with those around him. Students sought his advice not only about philosophy, but about practical matters of life. Wealthy citizens trusted his judgment. Friends relied on his wisdom. He became, in many ways, a living example of the philosophical life he encouraged others to pursue. Yet despite his growing reputation, Plotinus never believed that intellectual achievement alone was enough. In fact, he warned against a danger that continues to affect educated people today: confusing knowledge with wisdom. A person may accumulate facts, master theories, and win arguments while remaining spiritually unchanged. Genuine growth requires more than information. It requires transformation. This belief placed him at odds with some rival philosophical schools. Certain thinkers emphasized logic above all else. Others focused on rhetoric or technical expertise. Plotinus respected reason, but he believed reason should ultimately lead beyond itself. The highest truths could not be fully captured by analysis alone. They required a kind of inner awakening, a direct recognition of reality that transcended ordinary thought. Such ideas attracted devoted followers, but they also invited criticism. Some accused him of drifting too far from traditional philosophy into mysticism. Others questioned whether experiences of unity could be trusted. Plotinus welcomed serious discussion, yet he remained remarkably confident in the direction of his thought. He believed philosophy should address the deepest needs of the human soul, not merely provide intellectual entertainment. As he entered the later years of his life, the Roman Empire around him continued to face political instability, economic pressures, and growing uncertainty. Emperors rose and fell. Power shifted constantly. The future appeared increasingly unpredictable. Against this backdrop, his philosophy offered something many people desperately wanted: a sense of permanence in a changing world. While governments, fortunes, and social structures could collapse, the deeper reality he described remained untouched. The older Plotinus became, the more his life seemed devoted to a single mission. He wanted to show that beneath the noise of ordinary existence lies a deeper order, a source of beauty, truth, and meaning that can never be destroyed by external events. It was an ambitious vision, perhaps one of the most ambitious in the entire history of philosophy. And as his final years approached, he would face the ultimate test of whether that vision could withstand the realities that every human being must eventually confront: decline, suffering, and mortality itself. In the final years of Plotinus's life, the philosophy he had spent decades developing was no longer merely a system of ideas. It had become a way of facing reality itself. This is where many philosophies reveal their true strength or weakness. It is easy to speak about wisdom when life is comfortable. It is much harder when the body begins to fail, when friends disappear, when age advances, and when death gradually moves from an abstract concept to a visible presence on the horizon. By this stage, Plotinus had spent years teaching in Rome. His reputation had spread throughout intellectual circles. Students traveled to learn from him. Influential figures sought his advice. Yet despite this success, he remained remarkably detached from the forms of recognition that consume so many human beings. The same man who had spent his life arguing that the soul should not become trapped by external things seemed increasingly determined to demonstrate that principle through his own conduct. The ancient world was not gentle with old age. There were no modern hospitals, advanced medicines, or sophisticated treatments. Illness often meant prolonged suffering. As Plotinus grew older, his health began to deteriorate significantly. Historical accounts suggest that he developed a painful condition that gradually weakened him. His eyesight suffered. Physical discomfort increased. The body that had carried him through decades of teaching slowly became more fragile. Yet what is remarkable is how little bitterness appears in the surviving descriptions of his final years. Many thinkers spend their lives constructing beautiful theories only to abandon them when reality becomes difficult. Plotinus appears to have done the opposite. The older he became, the more intensely he focused on the inward journey that had always stood at the center of his philosophy. If the soul truly belonged to a reality greater than the physical world, then aging was not the destruction of the self. It was a reminder that the deepest part of a person had never been identical with the body in the first place. This did not mean he ignored suffering or pretended pain was pleasant. Rather, he viewed suffering within a larger framework. Human beings often define themselves through temporary conditions. Health becomes identity. Success becomes identity. Youth becomes identity. Social status becomes identity. Then life removes these things one by one, forcing people to confront a frightening question. Who are you when the things you depend upon begin to disappear? For Plotinus, this question lay at the heart of philosophy itself. His answer was radical. Beneath changing circumstances exists something more fundamental than any role, achievement, possession, or physical condition. The soul's true nature cannot be measured by wealth, beauty, popularity, or power. These things belong to the surface of existence. They rise and fall like waves. The deeper reality remains. It is perhaps one of the reasons his philosophy survived for so long. Every generation faces the same human fears. Fear of failure, fear of insignificance, fear of aging, fear of death. Technologies change. Political systems change. Cultures change. Yet these anxieties remain remarkably constant. Plotinus offered a response that was neither simple optimism nor despair. He suggested that much of human suffering comes from attaching ourselves too completely to things that were never permanent. His influence after death became extraordinary. Porphyry carefully gathered his writings and organized them into what became known as the Enneads, the collection through which later generations would encounter his thought. Without this effort, Plotinus might have become a forgotten teacher remembered only through scattered references. Instead, his ideas traveled across centuries. Christian theologians found themselves wrestling with concepts he had developed. St. Augustine, one of the most influential figures in Christian history, was profoundly affected by Neoplatonic thought. Islamic philosophers later engaged deeply with ideas that originated in Plotinus' system. During the Renaissance, when Europe rediscovered many classical texts, his writings once again inspired scholars searching for connections between philosophy, spirituality, and human nature. What makes this legacy particularly fascinating is that many people influenced by Plotinus did not agree with him completely. Some modified his ideas. Others criticized certain aspects of his philosophy. Yet even those who disagreed often found themselves unable to ignore him. He had asked questions too fundamental to dismiss easily. What is the source of existence? Why does beauty move us? Why do human beings remain restless even after achieving what they thought they wanted? Is there a deeper reality beneath ordinary experience? These questions continue to resonate because they emerge from the structure of human life itself. Even today, in an age dominated by science, technology, and material progress, the concerns that animated Plotinus have not disappeared. People still accumulate possessions and wonder why fulfillment remains elusive. They still achieve goals only to discover that another desire quickly replaces the previous one. They still encounter moments of beauty that feel strangely transcendent. They still sense that there may be dimensions of existence that cannot be reduced entirely to material explanations. One does not need to accept every aspect of Plotinus's philosophy to appreciate the challenge he presents. He asks listeners to consider whether modern life sometimes mistakes distraction for meaning, whether constant activity prevents deeper reflection, whether the endless pursuit of external rewards can ever satisfy desires that may ultimately point beyond the external world altogether. Perhaps that is why his voice still feels surprisingly alive after nearly 1800 years. He was not merely offering answers. He was directing attention toward a mystery that most people spend their lives overlooking. The mystery that beneath the noise of daily existence lies a deeper question about who we are and what we are truly seeking. In the end, Plotinus devoted his life to the belief that every human being carries within themselves a longing for something greater than temporary success or pleasure. Whether one interprets that longing spiritually, psychologically, or philosophically, it remains one of the most persistent features of human existence. We search, we strive, we achieve, we lose, and still something within us continues asking for more. Not necessarily more possessions, not necessarily more status, but more reality, more truth, more understanding, more connection to whatever lies at the foundation of existence itself. Plotinus believed that longing was not a mistake. It was a clue, a sign that the soul remembers, however faintly, that it belongs to something larger than the changing world around it. And perhaps the enduring power of his philosophy lies in this simple possibility, that behind the endless movement of life, behind success and failure, joy and suffering, beginnings and endings, there exists a deeper unity waiting to be discovered by those willing to look beyond appearances and ask what is truly real.